As we get into chapter 8, Paul is reaching one of his crescendos. He is drawing together a whole bunch of stuff that he has already written, and you almost get this sense of fervor or sense of pacing. He's getting excited, and he's got a lot to say. And so I feel particularly bad for Tertius, who's his scribe, who's tasked to write all of this down as Paul just yammers on and on. But his point actually really begins in chapter 7. And he says it like this. It's a fairly well-known passage, but he says, the good that I want to do, I don't do. And the evil that I don't want to do, I do. And right there is the complicated, frustrating, dark tension that is human nature. We want to do the right thing and then we don't. And we want to avoid doing the wrong thing, but we end up doing it anyway. And it's you might remember Jesus as he's dying on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do, but at least for me, and I'm assuming I'm not alone in this, how many times do you say, Father, forgive me, I knew exactly what I was doing? You get into that argument or something and things start getting personal and you just have this thing in the back of your head that says, hey, you should say that. That'll really put them in their place. That'll really scorch the earth. That's the nuclear option. And then the other voice inside your head says, don't say that. What are you doing? No, don't say it. Don't say it. I know you want to. Don't say it. Don't say it. Don't say it. You just said it. And now things are so much worse. But these aspects of our lives, this tendency that we don't want to entertain those arrogant thoughts. We don't want to give in to this and that, and then ultimately we do, and we're stuck asking, why? Shouldn't I be beyond this? And interpreters, readers of Paul, for quite some time, as he was saying this, they were saying, well, he's just using it as an example. He's not really experiencing this himself, which I think is nonsense. Of course Paul experienced that. Paul has no problem being honest about the struggle that is human nature. So as he lays this out, that we are frustrated and we are stuck, he then takes a hard shift and he says, therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So something has happened, that God has sent his son, and we human beings who are stuck in this cycle, this cycle of sin and death and misery, somehow he has interrupted this. Something has changed on the cosmic level. But he says something interesting. He writes in circles, and he's doing it for a reason. He says in verse 8, those controlled by the sinful nature cannot please God. So we have chapter 7, I want to do the right thing and I don't. I don't want to do the wrong thing, but I do. Now there's no condemnation. And then this odd kind of dark sounding verse that says, those controlled by the sinful nature cannot please God. And so we're left wondering, what does it say about us? Now, verse 8 is, for me, one of the most comforting passages in the Bible, but not yet. It takes a minute to explain. We'll actually get to that later. But I'm reminded of something that Martin Luther, the great reformer, had said in this obscure document that nobody reads. In explaining this concept, he says, consider your best work, the best that you have to offer, to be your most mortal sin. Well, that's kind of a downer. The best that you have to offer, the greatest deed, the most important sacrifices you've ever made for God and for family and for others, that is your most mortal, damnable sin. Well, what's the fun in that? Hold that thought. Because in verse 9, Paul says, you, however, and he says that you to the Romans to whom he is writing, and just the same, he says it to you today, to the people of St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Orange, California. You are not controlled, or you are controlled not by the sinful nature, but by the Spirit. That whatever it is that Jesus has done by taking on the human experience in flesh, going to his death and then defeating death, that has changed who you are on a fundamental level. That true human beings struggle with this tension between doing the right thing and then failing miserably, but you are not defined by that sinful nature anymore. You have been brought into God's family. We had a baptism the previous service. That young child has now received the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. That same Spirit is in your lives too. And where the Spirit of God is, the dead get raised. Which means maybe in small, unnoticeable ways, or maybe in large, very obvious ways, God is actively at work within you to make you more how he wants you to be. Paul is reminding his people of who they are. Now, all throughout the Hebrew Bible, one of the most common things that you will read is something like this phrase: remember you were slaves in Egypt and God set you free. That is the founding moment for Israel and for God's people. They were slaves and God rescued them in the Exodus. And so it is no surprise that when Jesus is spending his last night with his disciples before his death, it is a Passover celebration, and instead of reminding them that they were slaves in Egypt and God set them free, he gives his body and his blood as if to say, there's a new Exodus that's about to happen. But in this case, it is not the Egyptians or some foreign power. You are slaves to yourself. You are slaves to this nature that drags you into the mud, that seems to make you just want the toxic things in your lives, spiritually and emotionally and physically. That tendency, that nature that draws us to the worst in us is our slaver, and Jesus, by giving his body and his blood, are rescuing us. And so Paul is saying, that is who you are. Chapter 7, that's who you were. But who you are is something different, whether it feels like it in the moment or not. Now, he talks about sonship, and he says in verse 12, therefore, brothers, we have an obligation, and verse 15, you have received the spirit of sonship. And a lot of times when we get to this point in translations, I will complain, because the way Greek works, when you have like a plural masculine pronoun or noun, it can be inclusive. Like you could just as easily translate that as brothers and sisters. But I wouldn't want to do that in this case, because this is actually Paul being subversive. See, the idea of sonship and adoption is really important, not just in the Bible, but actually in the ancient world, in Rome. Adoption was common, especially for the upper echelon, the elite, the senators, the ruling class, the aristocrats. But you would never adopt a child, because you don't know how that child's going to turn out. You would adopt somebody who's maybe a little older, late teens, early 20s. Caesar Augustus was the adopted son of Julius Caesar at roughly that age. Because say that you're a powerful senator, and you've got your family, you've got your biological kids, and what's the difference, of course, between an adopted child and a biological child? Nothing. It's just the same, period. And you've got your biological children, but say that they're kind of dumb. and they're not going to be effective leaders. They're not going to be able to take the wealth and power that you've amassed and turn it into something good. Caesar Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, inherited his entire army and then conquered the Mediterranean. It's a pretty large shadow to fall under. But say, you're thinking of your legacy, and now in, civil, polite society, you've met some other people. You've met, a young, 17, 20-year-old kid who's really smart. He's excelled in schooling. He has got this reputation then you would adopt him. And he would de facto become your child. He would be your heir. And so that when you died, it would be all passed on to him. Now, this would only apply to men, not women. Women were not allowed to take part in this kind of thing. So when Paul starts talking about our sonship, and he's referring to his brothers, he knows he's writing to men and women. He mentions them in chapter 16. He is being subversive, saying that God has done something subversive. Male, female, doesn't matter anymore. You are all children of God. You are heirs of God. And he even says you are a co-heir of Christ. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus himself, your co-heir. In other places, he is described as your brother. That is a subversive way of talking about how things happen in new creation. That we are all on the same playing field. That for the women here, you are my brothers in Christ, as a way of saying in ancient words, those barriers are torn down. Now, for the men here, you're not off the hook. You are also the bride of Christ. Don't you feel pretty? But it's true. The New Testament uses these odd shifts of gender language because it doesn't matter anymore. We are all under Jesus. We are adopted into his family. We are given an inheritance of the Almighty Creator of the universe because he sent his Son, our adopted brother, to die in our place. And the same Spirit that raised him from the dead is now the Spirit that defines you. And the most dangerous, toxic thing in the life of a Christian is not just like making mistakes or something like that, but making mistakes and then buying into the lie that those mistakes are what define you. Of seeing that tension of human nature and seeing myself for who I really am and despairing. That is a lie, because I am not, and you are not defined by those moments of despair. You are defined by the Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead and who is actively raising you from the dead too. Now, like I said, in verse 8, those controlled by sinful nature cannot please God. I take that as incredibly good news. Because if I am incapable of pleasing God, if even my best attempts, my best work are never as altruistic as I'd like them to be, my intentions stain everything. This inner life of this sinful nature stains everything I do. I have nothing to offer God that's valuable. And yet we are adopted into his family. That adoption is not based on us. It is not something we earn. It is not something that we have to work hard at. It is free, it is open, and it is entirely dependent on God himself, because we bring nothing to the table. That can be scary, or it can set you free. That you stand as an heir, a true child of the living God. And it's because he chose you. His Spirit came to you in your baptism. He is growing you in your faith because that's what he does. So my prayer for us is that we never forget that we are not defined by our mistakes. We are not defined by this sinful nature that leads to death, but that we stand as children of God, that at the core of us is the very Spirit of God that hovered over the waters in creation and raised Jesus from the dead. My prayer is that we never forget who we are because of what God has done. Please pray with me.